Welcome to Laptop Radio. The topic today is non-trivial pixel elementary particle of modern media. We have Dr. Alvy Smith with us, the co-founder of Pixar. Hello, Alvy. How are you?
Hi, Michelle. Glad to be here today.
Where are you now?
Berkeley, right across the water, I guess. Are you in Palo Alto?
KZSU is at Stanford, and I'm in the Bay Area, but I tend not to share where my location is just in case I'm stuck. I love Berkeley. I went to UC Berkeley, so
there you go. Right.
Berkeley is awesome.
My wife is a professor here at Berkeley, which is the reason we live nearby the campus.
Oh, awesome. Professor of what?
Cognitive development of children between 0 and 5. She's a psychologist and a philosopher.
Oh, really cool. Really cool.
Heavily involved with AI types these days who want to know what is it that children do that we could learn to teach our AIs with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, AI is really interesting. I tutored AP biology and AP history to high school students, but it's a little bit different because I think the high school students are a little bit more developed than children themselves. Tell us about yourself.
Well, why don't I start with AI in Stanford? I came to Stanford in 1965, 50 or 60, however many years ago that was, a long time ago, to learn what? AI. This new thing called AI, artificial intelligence. Such a sexy sounding thing then. It still is, isn't it? One of the great marketing terms, at least. And after a couple of years, I decided, you know what? I don't think this is going to happen in my lifetime, that we'll understand intelligence with a computer, right? I'm starting to reassess. So I changed fields, of course, and I decided to do something like, hey, make the first digital movie that I could actually accomplish in my lifetime. But now that's been done. Looking around, look, AI is still here. Some of the AI stuff is very impressive. I've been watching all along from the sidelines, and I may have been wrong back then. What if I had stayed in AI all these decades?
As I remember, TV used to be black and white, and then there's color. How is that like with computer graphics?
Well, you just reminded me of a joke. I used to tell my kids that back in the old days, there was no color. And then one day color got invented. And I said, Dad, no, that can't be true.
That's true. That's true. Right?
When I started out in computer graphics, there was no color. It was black and white. That's for sure. And in fact, my first job out of Stanford was as a professor at New York University. My first chairman was a man named Herbert Freeman, who happened to be one of the earliest researchers in computer graphics. One of the very earliest, and I didn't quite understand the luck of that choice. Now, I grew up painting pictures, oils and acrylics on canvas. I kind of always tried to find some way to marry art and computers. And I think Herb Freeman knew that. So he hired me into his department thinking that he could seduce me into computer graphics. One day I said, Herb, if you ever get color, I'm there. but he didn't get it. The computers weren't fast enough for color yet. But in fact, when I did see color for the first time, which was at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, Xerox PARC, I leapt at it. And there's been no going back. You could say Pixar came out of that because I saw I could paint on a program on a computer that my friend Dick Shelp had built at Xerox PARC. And as soon as I saw that, boy, it changed everything. That's why I'm talking to you today.
We're going to talk about metaverses later for sure. But let's talk about your role at Pixar. You co-founded Pixar. How is that like when you founded it from a long time ago?
Well, it was 86. I was already getting on up there. I'm way up there in age now, but I was already up there when we co-founded Pixar. Ed Catmull and I co-founded Pixar. By the way, we didn't know it was going to be Pixar, did we? We're just a group of people trying to make the first digital movie.
Awesome.
And we came up with that idea on Long Island at a place called New York Institute of Technology on the fabulous North Shore of Long Island. It was Great Gatsby land. There were mansions everywhere. We worked in mansions. We had video in one mansion, computer graphics in another mansion. My girlfriend lived in a third mansion. We lived in a fourth mansion. It was all mansions that this rich benefactor, Alexander Schur, had put together as his campus. And he also had a complete animation studio there of the old-fashioned variety where you You drew India ink lines on clear celluloid, and then you painted opaque colors between the lines from the backside, the old-fashioned way. His idea was somehow we could use the computer to do that job better. So he had the right idea. He just happened to be 10 or 20 years too early. But we got the idea, watching how hard those animators work, that we should be the first people to make a completely digital movie. And not knowing that it would take us 20 years to do it. 75 is when we started at New York Tech. Toy Story came out in 95. So it took 20 years of lots of ups and downs and crazy men and rich people and so forth.
95. I remember that there were Walkmans around that time, and that there were analog VCR that plays digital.
In my book, Biography of the Pixels is the name of my book, by the way. It's over my shoulder there.
It's right there.
Yeah, right there.
It's right there.
A review in Wired magazine just came out today.
My question is, what is the convergence of technology that allow for color?
What I'm celebrating in the book is what I call the Great Digital Convergence. Up until about 2000, Toy Story is kind of the signal that things were changing. Let's just call it the millennium. At 2000, the Great Digital Convergence happened, and nobody seemed to pay any attention that it happened. But I'm celebrating it in this book. All the old analog media types, film and video and ink on paper and photographic emulsions, all of that converged into one single medium, the bit. In the case of pictures, we package those bits as pixels. And the fact that people don't know what pixels are is what motivated me to write the book.
All right, let me ask you the very, very basic question. What is a pixel?
Okay, I'll start by telling you what it is not. It is not a little square. All right. I went out to Google the other day. I typed in the word pixel, and you can look for images to illustrate your word. Typed on images, and all of a sudden, all these pictures came up of tilings of little squares, little abutting squares of color, pixelations, as you referred to it earlier. That's what people think digital pictures are supposed to look like, but they never have ever been that way. That's one of the messages I want to get across. That just because you want to believe that a computer makes little squares isn't enough to justify that. They don't do it that way, is what I'm trying to say. They don't do it that way. In fact, if you look around, let's look at the Zoom screen we're looking at right now. Do you see any little squares?
Nope.
No, there aren't any little squares. And it's not just because they're tiny. They never were. What you're seeing is lots of little blobs of light that overlap one another, and they form a continuous image, and that's what that continuous image is what we're looking at. The pixels that drive those little glowy spots are invisible. You can't see a pixel. That's another message. You can't see a pixel. That's a surprise to most people. I have about 1 billion pixels in my cell phone, and I bet you do too. But you can only see one of them at a time, one picture at a time on the display screen. So all those other pixels that are out there in your cell phone, you can't see them. That's because you can't see pixels. They're just stored in a file somewhere. If you double click on the name of the picture title or something, suddenly your cell phone will display that picture. And it happens so fast because of the computer in the cell phone. It seems instantaneous to us puny human beings. It's not. A real hairy computation happens every time you look at a picture. But it's not the pixels you're seeing. Those pixels are being spread by the little glowy spots on the screen that I call display elements. Pixels are discrete, digital, separated, spiky, and you can't see them. Display elements that you and I are looking at right now on our Zoom screens are soft, glowy things that have color, they're analog, they overlap. They're completely different things than pixels. And yet people have confused those two things for many, many years. So I'm trying to set the record straight.
Can I say that a pixel is kind of like an atom where you can't see them, but the graphic stuff is made out of pixels?
That's kind of the way I look at it. They're the elementary particle of the modern world. Underappreciated, very sophisticated concept. There's nothing approximate about a pixel. Okay, so where did that little square, you used the word pixelation earlier. Where did that idea that digital pictures were pixelated come from? Well, I've thought about this a lot, and I've come up with two reasons. One of them is every app has a zoom feature.
Oh
And
yeah.
zoom is a dirty trick that should be wiped out of existence because it's a lie. When you zoom in on a picture by, let's say, 20, by a factor of 20, what zoom does, it repeats each pixel 20 times horizontally and then takes each one of those rows and repeats it 20 times vertically. In other words, it replaces each pixel by a 20 by 20 square array of copies of that pixel,
Mhm.
which looks like, guess what? A little square. But it's not a picture of the pixel up close. It's a picture of the little square that Zoom, in its lie, has forced on us. Okay, now I think people have put up with Zoom because they want to believe that that is, in fact, what pictures look like up close, but they don't.
Mhm.
They don't. Uh, Another reason that I think people believe in the little pixelated square idea of pixels is because, and I try to make this clear in my book, people have always had the wrong idea of what computers are. They think they are rigid, linear, mechanical, plotting, unesthetic. They're machines. And any pictures that comes out of a machine like that has got to be linear, rigid, blocky. When people were presented the notion of pixelation, they said, oh, that they just naturally believe that's what computers are doing because they think computers are rigid. Computers are the most malleable instrument that humankind has ever invented. There's nothing about computers that limits them to linear, rigid, blocky, staccato, none of that. A good counterexample are some of the avatars that are now available in the world of human beings, convincing human beings in emotional close-up, absolutely convincing there's nothing rigid, linear, squarish, mechanical about that. And yet people still seem to be satisfied with this little pixelated notion that that's what's going on. No, get rid of it. It's not right. Never has been right. Even the first, I've got the first digital picture in my book, and even it is not little squares. I mean, it never happened.
I agree with you. I make avatars for fun. No, human avatars, not
Yeah,
pixel avatars. I completely agree with you. What are some of your good memories at Pixar?
I like to think of Pixar as not just Pixar, but all the way
Mhm.
back to New York Tech. It's this group of people that we all found each other
Mhm.
and we all realized that we were headed for the same thing, which was to make the first movie, and that it was actually doable as soon as Moore's Law delivered enough computer horsepower. And we were willing to wait for the Moore's Law to develop because we knew it would. The group at New York Tech became the group at Lucasfilm.
Mhm.
And I directed the Genesis demo at Lucasfilm. It was sort of the first time on the big screen of the group that became later known as Pixar. And then, because George and Marshall Lucas got divorced, Ed and I started Pixar to give a home to this world-class group of people so they wouldn't disperse. We're still waiting for the computer to get fast enough to make a movie. So we built hardware. We did all kinds of stuff to keep the group together and survive until, lo and behold, in about 1990, 91, Disney finally knocked on our door and said, hey guys, let's make that movie you always wanted to make. And they paid for it.
Whose idea was that movie?
Well, the idea of making the movie was all of our ideas. It was the movie. That particular movie, that story, was John Lasseter's. I think people know by now that all of Pixar's movies come from inside Pixar. We don't
Mhm.
go outside to get the stories. So they're generated by the people. Actually, some of the greatest artists, by the way, are these animators. Animators and actors are the same skill, I believe.
Mhm.
An actor or actress convinces you that he or she is somebody completely different than they are, right?
Mhm.
That's their job. And
Mhm.
if they're a lousy actor, you don't believe it. If they're a wonderful actor, you completely buy into their fictitious persona.
Mhm.
Same thing with an animator. They convince you that a stack of polygons is conscious or feels pain or is conniving. And if they don't do a good job of it, you don't buy it for a moment. It's bad acting. But if they do a good job of it, you're totally sucked in by the character. It's the same skill. I've asked lots of actors and animators, and they all agree it's the same skill.
What is your favorite Pixar movie?
Oh, that's easy. The Incredibles. It's kind of an obscure reason. Growing up, I grew up in New Mexico, and we had Ford automobiles. My family always had Ford automobiles, not Chevys. Those were the other people. We had Fords. And if you had a Ford car, then you got a magazine, a little small magazine called Ford Times
Mhm.
every month. And I loved Ford Times as a kid because there were artists drew pictures of what the future looked like in
Mhm.
far off 1980 or 1990, way off in the future. They had these pictures of what it was going to look like. And I cut out all these pictures and put them in my scrapbook. The main thing I remember was everybody wore capes and had boots that came up to a point above the knee.
Mhm.
And the cars were swoopy and the houses were swoopy, just like in Incredibles. In fact, I looked at Incredibles. I said, that's Ford Times. And I asked Brad Bird, said, Brad? He says, oh yeah, that's Ford Times. And if you think about it, the cape is a story element
Mhm.
in the Incredibles. And they did away with the pointy boots somewhere. They just did away with that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love Toy Story.
Yeah, well, that was our first, right? That was our baby. So yeah,
Yeah.
gotta love it. Just nobody could believe it when they saw it. They didn't understand that this was a whole new way of doing movies, but it was.
Yeah, that's an awesome movie. I actually have a Pixar book here with me. There was a class on storytelling and Pixar at UC Berkeley a couple years ago. And I think Matt, I don't know if you know him, he basically gave a talk on storytelling and the Pixar process. It's beautiful. But it's not just animating, it's also the ability to tell a story.
Oh, it's all about story. That's our fundamental laws. If you don't have a story, you haven't got anything. And if you haven't got great actors, in other words, animators, then you can't turn your story into a convincing drama that sucks an audience in.
How about the business side of running a company? You're a co-founder.
Kicking and screaming.
How is it like creating a co-founder an art company? Today, we see a lot of NFT companies, which is really art-related companies,
I guess, yeah.
very popular. And
Yes,
I would say that you're kind of the godfather of NFT artsy companies. So how is
I
that?
guess so. Well, I see myself as a kind of a special combination of artist and scientist, and that's what Pixar is basically. But a lot of companies, the technically creative people look down their noses at the artistically creative people, or vice versa. I've been in both places. At Microsoft, if you're smart, you program. Otherwise, you do this easy stuff called marketing and art. We didn't ever,
Easy
we
stuff.
never, we never allowed that kind of disdain to happen at Pixar. And in a lot of graphic arts houses, you're the creatives or you're those lowly technoids. No, 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 no. None of that. None of that distinction. At Pixar, you have the technically creative people who are geniuses beyond belief, and you have the artistically creative people who are geniuses in their world beyond belief, and they have to work together. And working together means mutual admiration, mutual dignity, mutual everything, salaries, everything has to be. So that's the culture we put into Pixar, and I'm very, very proud of it because I think we pulled it off.
I love your culture. Even in the startup world, I think a lot of the engineers really think that marketing is hard, but they don't have product market fit because they don't care about marketing.
Marketing is a great creative art form. It's just to look down your nose at that is to miss the point of it.
Yeah.
And by the way, honesty and speaking, I was an engineer by training before there was computer science. And I thought that's what you did if you weren't a really smart person. I had this Microsoft point of view, right?
Yeah.
Boy, did I get rid of that when I started my own companies. Marketing, good marketing is one of the most creative things you can possibly do.
I've been doing a lot of creative coding.
What do you mean by creative coding?
Just making generative art, making art spin, circles, move according to the mouse, interactive art. I also do a lot of AR, augmented reality art. I also
Mm-hmm.
create metaverses, right? And
Yeah.
all those things are based on a pixel. How do you think a pixel would play in the role of spatial augmented reality metaverse on the web with our Oculus or whatever glasses that we wear? And
I use
even
Oculus.
yeah, exactly. In these spatial worlds and even beyond the web, where we can see layers of colors, we call it spatial web. How important is that pixel when it's taken outside of the graphic elements into other dimensions?
Well, this is where I think the fact that it's the elementary particle of everything we see becomes important. But let me back up in my answer to you and say, one of the points of my book is we humans are lousy at predicting the future. Moore's law says, and continues to say, by the way, that everything good about computers gets an order of magnitude better every 5 years. An order of magnitude is a factor of 10. And I use that terminology, order of magnitude, instead of the arithmetical factor of 10, because it's the limit of what humans are capable of. We cannot think beyond a factor of 10, one order of magnitude. And yet Moore's law is giving us a new order of magnitude every 5 years. Since 1965, where Moore's law was 1, today Moore's law factor is 100 billion. And it's going to hit 1 trillion and just by 2025. We humans can't imagine what that means. We just have to get there to see what it means. I can give you the big number and say, well, I can probably click a movie title 5 years from now and it'll instantaneously come up on the screen. But somehow that's just speed. It doesn't tell you the new things that will become available, which is what I think you're alluding to. What I'm tracking right now, because it's within my order of magnitude, is mixed reality. I'm advising a virtual reality company called Baobab Studios in Silicon Valley, who want to be the Pixar VR, right? That sounded good to me. AR is when you take virtual reality and superimpose it on the real world coming in. All right. You're mixing digitized real world with an artificially generated computer graphics world. Mixed reality says, let's go one step further. Let's extract the model of the real world as we scan it. It's coming into our eyes, and our computers are now getting fast enough they can actually extract a 3D model to represent that real world, like my office, and mix that model with one that I'm generating inside my computer that's totally fake. And you put those two computer models together, and this is a hard problem, by the way. Probably keep researchers busy for the next 5 or 10 years figuring out how to do all this. All right. How does that teapot in this real world cast a shadow in my artificially generated world? How can I see through that teapot to what's in my artificially generated world? That's what it means to mixed reality. All right. So that'll keep us busy. And who knows where that's going to go?
I do see a shadow.
Well, yeah, but it's not casting a shadow on a fake scene.
I know, I'm just teasing
a
you.
virtual scene. Yeah.
I'm just teasing you. We do shadows on AR when we make 3D objects, of course, but those are fake, fake objects. And, I think mixing the real and the fake are a little bit different.
I have a dear friend for many years who has used paint programs to generate her art for many years. And she's now using Tilt Brush in VR. I guess this is starting to approach MR. She paints strokes in 3D, in other words, but those strokes have texture, they cast shadows, they're lit, all these things that we associate with 3D graphics. And then she takes those scenes and mixes them with what she's scanning in her studio or her home and comes up with these completely compelling paintings that just suck me right in. I'm really hoping that the artists of the world are the ones that I've come up with this notion in the book called the central dogma. It's just not been articulated before, but if you think about it, all of Pixar's movies and all the other digital movies out there assume that the objects are defined by Euclidean geometry and that they are rendered into perspective using Renaissance perspective, and that their optical properties and other physical properties follow Newtonian physics. All right. There's nothing about computers that requires those three things. Nothing. It's a self-imposed discipline that I call the central dogma. And there's a lot of creative space inside that. I call it a symphonic form of movies. As attested by all the Pixar movies, there's lots of creativity still in that very bound space. But I'm saying artists of the world, break out of the central dogma. There's no reason that pictures made with computers be Euclidean, Renaissance, and Newtonian. That's because we wanted a lot of our pictures to interact with the real world, which does follow those theories.
When you're founding Pixar and companies after that, How is your team like, and how do you interact with your other co-founders? Because sometimes one person is not enough. Sometimes it takes a whole team to build something and scale it, right?
That's certainly true with Pixar. And another one of the many points in my book is when it comes to high technology, there's no one genius from which all things flow. That's a simple narrative that seduces human beings, but it's just not the way things happen. It's these families of people all interacting, stabbing each other in the back, even, stealing ideas from each other across country, national boundaries, through time. It takes family, I call them flow charts or family trees, to show you how things actually develop. And that's what happens inside a company too. So we had this amazing group of geniuses at Pixar. One of the pleasures I had as being a boss was that these people just come and tell me what they're going to do. I didn't have to assign tasks. It was just, I know it's, a lot of people don't understand that everybody knew what the goal was. The goal was to make the first movie.
Mhm.
And everybody said, oh, okay, let's see. Somebody needs to do motion blur. Okay, I'll do motion blur. Somebody said, I need to do paint program. Okay, I'll do paint program. Somebody else, just like that. People just grabbed it and did it. Didn't have to order. And then they would come to me, kind of, Papa, and show me what they had just accomplished every day. And I would just sit there, be beaming of, what my kids were showing me. My kids being barely younger than me. So that works. That works, I guess, if you have a bunch of geniuses. It starts getting a little more difficult when you go from 50 to 100 to 1,000 to 2,000 people. Then you have to have real management structure and hierarchies and all that.
Yeah.
I don't want to diminish the importance of such structure.
Yeah. I think that's a growth structure. I think it's usually agile in startup environments until it becomes more corporate.
One of the reasons I like being an advisor to Baobab Studios is because it's a way for me to keep my hands in that very exciting entrepreneurial pie that young people have. They're willing to take a chance on life and bet their family's fortunes to this new startup idea. Great. They're going for it. With all my notion of startups is it pulls the best out of us human beings. You've got to be not only good at programming, say, or animating, but negotiating and meetings and psychology, and it just takes everything. Marketing, all these things have to come together to succeed, and often they don't. But boy, the electricity around a startup company is not to be missed.
How about working with investors? We heard that Steve Jobs invested in Pixar. How was that like?
Well, he's pretty horrible. Steve Jobs and we didn't like each other.
Just FYI, I used to work at Apple. I used to work at Apple when Steve Jobs was alive.
Okay. We didn't like each other a whole lot. Let's just leave it at that. Okay. And the details are all out there. But let me just say something good about Steve Jobs. I don't have very many good things, but this is a biggie. All right. This is a biggie. When Ed and I came up with the idea of founding Pixar, we wrote a business plan and we did what you do with a business plan. We started shopping it to investors. We shopped it 45 times. 35 venture capital firms said no, 35. Then we decided to form a partnership with a large corporation, a strategic partnership, we called it. 8 large corporations said no. Finally, 2 almost said yes, almost. That's the key word. General Motors and Philips of the Netherlands almost went in together to finance us. But it was the branch of General Motors run by H. Ross Perot. Do you remember this guy? H. Ross Perot ran for president of the United States. He was a real character. And if there's anybody who probably would have been worse for Pixar than Steve Jobs, it would have been H. Ross Perot. But anyhow,
okay. I got it.
He blew away the deal at the very last moment. And that's when Ed and I says, oh, okay, let's call up Steve Jobs. This is a Hail Mary final. We're about to give up.
Wait, do you guys know him before, or you guys just cold called him?
No, we didn't cold call him. We knew him before. He had come to us after he'd been thrown out of Apple, and he invited Ed and me and our financial guy down to his mansion in Woodside. And we're sitting out on the grass when Steve proposes that he buy us from George Lucas, and run us as his next company. And we said, no, we want to run our own company, but we'll take your money. And he said, okay. But what he had to offer for capitalization was about half of what General Motors and Philips were offering. Basically, he got left out of the Lucasfilm offices. Lucasfilm had to okay any such deal because they own part of us. But at this point, after 45 failures and getting funded, we figured Lucasfilm was at the end of their tether. Everybody's about to give up. We called Steve and said, just make exactly the same offer again, the one at about half the valuation. Just make exactly the same one again. We think Lucasfilm is in such a bad place, they'll go for it. And they did.
Oh, wow.
So that's how we got Steve Jobs. And he kept putting money in for many years until he was about 50 million bucks in. That's old dollars, right? That was about half of what he had made at his Apple fortune. He had made about 100 million at Apple. 50 of it went into Pixar. Now, he would have sold us at any time if somebody would have stepped forward with 50 million bucks. But nobody stepped forward. And we kept failing. We were a hardware company, mind you, during this time because we couldn't make movies yet. So we were a hardware company. He was a hardware guy. Every time we'd run out of money, which is failure in Silicon Valley, Steve would tear Ed Catmull and me apart, but he would write a check because he could not stand the embarrassment of having a failure after having been kicked out of Apple. 2 or 3 or 4 times he wrote checks and took away our equity, by the way. In other words, it was a standard corporation. He owned a majority, but he didn't buy us.
Yeah.
But over time, he did buy us. Over the course of several refinancings, he kept, writing another check to keep us alive. And he would take away equity until finally he had all the equity.
He has the majority of the equity. How do you manage him as an investor?
Kept him out of the building. We always made sure that we had our board meetings. Ed and I and Steve were the board. We always had the meetings at Next, which he had started by then, which was down on the peninsula, and wouldn't let him into our building because he always upset people too much. Now, I told you I was going to say something good about Steve. Regardless of the reason for keeping us refinanced, I think his reasons were bogus for embarrassment. He didn't want to be embarrassed. But the bottom line is he did keep us alive for 5 years. And during that 5 years, Moore's Law did its thing. At the end of it, Disney knocked on our door, said, let's make that movie. And Disney paid for it. They basically saved Steve Jobs' reputation. That's one thing you have to thank him for. He kept us alive, regardless of his reasons, which I think were bogus. Then he had this brilliant business idea, and that was to take Pixar public on nothing more than Toy Story in the can. Toy Story, the critics in New York had said, wow, this is a hell of a movie. And he just on that, he took Pixar public and became a billionaire overnight.
Yeah, and all the merchandise that came with the movie, right?
So yeah, he that was a brilliant business thing, but he had nothing to do with the movies. Movies weren't his idea. Movies would have been our idea for 20 years. As a hardware guy, he gave us no advantage in the hardware world. We went broke again and again and again. And he and I, well, enough said, we didn't get along.
Yeah, I used to work at Apple. I understand things are constantly moved around based on what he likes and doesn't like, like when he walks by something.
A tyrant, a bully, and a liar is my summary. But he kept us alive financially.
After you make Toy Story, were you pretty excited or thrilled, like about
Toy Story?
Everything? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Are you kidding? Yes. This was our dream for 20 years. It happened. It could have been a lousy movie, but it wasn't. It was a spectacularly good movie. We couldn't be happier.
But what were some of the inspirations for some of the future movies?
Well, again, movies came out of the heads of the animation team. During this 5 years, while we were failing as a hardware company, we kept the animation team alive doing little shorts. One was called Luxo Jr., and another was called Red's Dream. Another was called Toy. Which for people who've had babies, that's no surprise. In some sense, Toy Story was that idea, the Tin Toy idea taken to the big screen and expanded into a movie. You just let the artistically creative guys loose and they kept us constantly supplied, as you can now tell, with great ideas for movies. Again, Steve had nothing to do with that process. He was at Next.
Were you guys more confident in making and creating new stories for Pixar?
Well, let me be pretty clear at this point. Because I had to get Steve Jobs out of my life, as soon as Toy Story was underway, I left and started another startup company
Mhm,
called Altamira Software, which I sold to Microsoft.
mhm.
My joke is I sold my first company to Steve Jobs and my second one to Bill Gates.
That's really cool though.
The team was off and running. I was not there when they decided what the next movie was going to be, so I can't answer your question.
Awesome. I wanted to talk about the writing of your book. What inspired you to write the book? I know it's available on Amazon. Can you tell us a little about the process of writing your book and what are some of the thoughts that you thought about while writing the book?
Well, I've sort of mentioned some of them already. About 10 years ago, I was asked by a professor of media arts in Melbourne, Australia, to give a talk on the taxonomy of digital light. I didn't know what that meant,
Mhm.
but the result of it was this book. I realized that nobody knows what a pixel is. And that seems crazy, especially now we're all swimming in, I estimate, zettapixels. That's a one with 21 zeros after it. Nearly all pictures in the world are digital now, made of pixels.
Mhm.
And in fact, nearly all pictures that have ever existed because of the digital explosion are now digital.
Mhm.
It's kind of crazy that we don't know what a pixel is, if that's the case. I understood that it's not a subtle light, it's not an easy idea. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to write a book about it, would I? I decided to write a book to explain the beauty of the idea of the pixel intuitively. There's no math in this book. I just strip that out and tell you what it is that makes it work. And I think I did a pretty good job, if I don't say so myself. It took me a lot of rewrites.
Mhm.
My wife says it's on about the 50th rewrite when you suddenly get that feeling that it's coming out of your mind, free flowing, uninterrupted, brilliant, and profound. After 50 to 100 rewrites. Yeah, that's right.
Wow,
Writing is hard.
that's slow, right?
You have to, it took me 10 years to write this thing. Part of that was because the histories that I had received and thought were correct all turned out to be wrong. I was amazed again and again to discover how wrong all the received histories are. And why is that? Here I am, a guy, I was born before computers. They didn't exist when I was born.
Mhm.
Why don't I know who built the first one? It seems like I've devoted my life to computers. I should know who. Well, everybody had a different answer what the first computer was. I don't know how many times I've heard that ENIAC was the first computer. No, it wasn't. It just wasn't. You have to define your terms. And once you define your terms carefully, you
Mhm.
can just read off the answers. There's nothing to it. So what's a computer? Now, a lot of people want to claim that if you've got a room full of vacuum tubes that's doing an arithmetic calculation, that's a computer. No, it's not. A computer has to be a stored program computer. It
Mhm.
has to store its data and its program exactly the same way. That's exactly what Alan Turing defined in 1936, and which and every computer that we now have is an electronic version of what Alan Turing told us about in 1936. And once you say it's got to be a stored program computer, boom, you can just read off who did what first. Turns out the first computer was named Baby. Who knew? I didn't know. Baby. Baby was built in 1948 in Manchester, England. And I went to visit Baby. You can already tell, I thought I knew the history. No, I didn't know. I had to go find the history. Boy, was I amazed at every turn. I went to see Baby in Manchester, and Baby's display had pixels. And the word Pixar was on its display scrolling. The first computer had pixels and it could animate. What? In 1948?
Oh, wow.
Well, I sort of had the received history that computer graphics began in the 60s. Ivan Sutherland wrote Sketchpad and it all descended from that. No, that's not the story at all. Why is it so wrong? I
Was
think
it
it's because
regulated? Just kidding.
it it had no, I mean it had pixels for sure, but it didn't have little squares, if that's what
Mhm.
you're asking. In fact, I have the very first picture on the very first computer in that book right there.
Oh, wow.
I call it first light, and they're not little squares. They're dots of two different sizes. Okay, it's just they never have been little squares, Michelle. They never have been. Even the oldest one. All right, then I found the first interactive game, 51, and the second one, 52, 53. Wait a minute, the early 50s had interactive graphics? That didn't fit what I'd heard and received.
Wait, are they black and white or are they colored?
Oh, absolutely. You know what? Color didn't come along. So I found a picture of the first pixels for the book. I said, okay, who had the first color pixels?
Yeah.
I thought we had them at Xerox PARC on that paint program that I told you about, Super Paint. I thought we had the first color pixels there. But the guy who built the program, Dick Shelp, said, I don't think so, Alvy. But he couldn't tell me who had them earlier. I did the research for the book and I found them. And I have the pictures of them. Turns out it took Moore's Law to give us color pixels. Moore's Law was stated in 1965. The first color pixels came along in 1967 on a simulator built for the Apollo Moon project. It has the first color pixel. I've got the picture in the book, and the story of how I did the sleuthing for this. And the stories are wonderful. I met these two old engineers who are now in their 80s who had done it, but nobody had ever recognized them for this because they had done it when there were no journals that would publish their papers, when the stuff they were doing was seen only by probably astronauts in some obscure NASA facility in Houston or someplace. I was able to find this stuff. Then I looked these guys up and they invited me to come down to spend a day with them in Salt Lake City, where they live now. And we had a ball. 7 hours later, I staggered out of there, having with them figured out exactly when and where and what date, all the technical.
Oh, wow.
Of the very first color pixel and the first color shaded graphics, 1967. Now I worked on Super Paint in 1973, 74.
Mhm.
So color pixels had happened 6 years earlier, and I didn't know that. That's the kind of things. This is easy stuff. I'm trying to put the easy blocks in place with this. Somebody else can come in and put all the details in.
When the color comes out, is it RGB or is it just different colors?
It was color mapped at first. You know what color map is? It's basically, well, let's say we have 1-bit pixels.
Mhm.
1 bit can control between 2 colors. If it's a direct control, then you get black or you get white. That's it.
Mhm.
But you can use a color map trick, which says store the definition of a color in an array.
Yeah.
Say it's an array with 2 rows, 24 bits long. That's enough to describe a color, each color among 16 million. You can have 2 completely different colors like mauve and chartreuse, but that's all. You can 1 bit will let you choose between 2 colors, but that's it. And it wasn't until we got up to 24 bits that things got really serious. In 1967, it was a 6-bit system. At Xerox PARC, we had an 8-bit system. And then at New York Tech, our crazy patron, Alex Schur, bought us the first 24-bit pixels in the world. It cost him about $2 million in today's money to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I asked, because I think we're a little bit spoiled with all the millions of hex.
Oh, you guys don't even know. You just have to. Not only can we not go forward, we humans are lousy at going forward on Moore's Law by order more than an order of magnitude. We can't go backward either. I don't think you have a clue about what it was like 2 or 3 or 4 orders of magnitude ago. And you know what? You don't have to know. You shouldn't. We did that suffering for you. You start from where it is now and go from there.
Alvy, is there anything you want to share that I have not asked you?
Oh, probably, but I'm probably talked out at this point. Like I said, I'm following AI. I'm following the reaches of maybe this last story. My wife and I were visiting on her sabbatical, Cambridge, England, Cambridge University, when an old buddy of mine who used to write filters for Photoshop approached me. He's a pixel packer like I am, right?
Yeah.
And he said, hey, Alvy, we don't have to program anymore. And I said, what? What do you mean? He said, read this paper. And he handed me a paper from the AI lab at Berkeley, which is the school right, about 2 blocks from here, and said, I call it the zebras and horse paper. They had taken a GAN, if you know what that is, and trained it to taken a GAN and they trained it with 1,000 pictures of horses, no text, just pictures,
Mhm.
and 1,000 pictures of zebras. And after it was trained, you could hand this GAN a picture, an arbitrary picture of horses, say, and it
Yeah.
would output the same picture where every horse had been turned into a zebra. Well, I looked at that and I went, what? I don't even think that's a well-posed problem. How does that work? He said, we don't know. He says, that's just it. It just does it, right? We don't know how it works. And all of a sudden I went, oh my God, I always thought that once I understood
Yeah.
AI, or once AI came along, I would be able to understand it. And now I'm going, oh no, it's often that
Yeah.
part of computation that's unknowable.
I had a story about light and filters. I was a professional photographer a long time ago.
Good.
And
Yeah.
I used to use Photoshop to move the light and create different filters to make people look really nice. But now there's Lightroom where you
Yeah.
can just use a filter and then it just does it automatically for you.
You blink and you get left in the dust. That's that,
Exactly. What is going on?
that's my experience. That's my experience of life, Michelle. Just try to hold on.
Okay. What is one piece of advice that you would like to share with the community?
Well, I'm going to reiterate. I want artists to approach the computer as a medium, and that means learn how the tool actually works. Don't use programs written by the man, because like Photoshop and Maya and all those, they have a certain point of view that they're going to force on you.
Mhm.
But there's nothing about a computer that forces you into their points of view. And I don't think we're really going to understand this fluid called computation
Mhm.
until the artists of the world, whom I think of as the explorers at the edges of our culture, go out there and start showing us what this medium is really capable of, instead of the kind of puny first steps we've made so far in 2021.
That's really awesome. And Dr. Alvy Smith, as a explorer of coding art or computation and art and spatial, it's been an honor to speak with you, especially here at my show at Stanford, where you went to school.
I did.
So I just want to thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.